Throughout World War II, women played a very important part in the conflict. In Britain, for example, whilst the men were fighting away in the armed forces, women would work inside of the fields as a land army, keeping Britain fed, and they would also work inside of factories making ammunition and other materials for the war effort. Many women had interesting jobs, such as shuttling aircraft from one place to another, and others also worked as engineers fixing equipment. But inside of the Soviet Union, women would be allowed to fight for their country, and Stalin, following losing many soldiers as the Germans launched Operation Barbarossa, would then permit women to serve inside the armed forces. Some of these would become infamous for their work as snipers, but other women would join Soviet resistance groups such as the Partisans, who would take the fight to the Germans who were occupying their lands. Women such as Lepa Radic faced a horrific execution if they were found involved in the Partisans, as the Germans found women involved on the battlefield fighting as archaic and horrific. Because of this, they executed them instantly and many women were slaughtered, and this was the same for the Soviet women soldiers. Join us today as we look at the brutal executions of the female Soviet soldiers of the Red Army, and as always, to support our channel, please make sure to subscribe. Despite a large proportion of women serving in the army for the Soviet Union, women had other roles fighting the Germans. There were a group of women aviators who trained as pilots, and there was no formal limit to begin with for women to serve in the armed forces at the start of the Second World War, but women were discouraged and were prevented from taking the fight to their enemies and bearing arms for the Soviets. But then, as there was a desperate requirement for bodies to fight in the Red Army and other military elements, the women were then accepted, and Stalin accepted the dire situation of the Second World War as the Red Army was suffering heavy losses, with the Germans launching Operation Barbarossa. The Soviet Union was the first country to allow women pilots to fly in combat missions, and there were whole regiments of women that flew around 30,000 combat sorties, and this led to many women being awarded the highest military honours. The 46th Command Guard's Night Bomber Aviation Regiment was known as the Night Witches, and these women flew 24,000 combat missions, and they bombed Germans from biplanes, which were considered rather old and outdated. But they worked very well, and the Germans learned of them and greatly feared them. The women would fly at high altitudes, then switch off their engines and glide to a bombing altitude, where in almost silence with no engine sounds, they would drop their payload and cause chaos. They were like ghosts, and they would cause a lot of confusion amongst the Germans. However, the action faced on the Eastern Front was some of the deadliest and most horrific in history. The Soviets took huge losses as the Germans pushed into the Soviet Union and invaded, and Stalin then had to think how he would replace the men he had lost in the early action. He lost many of his best and most experienced soldiers, and he then drafted women into the army, as he wanted them to take part in the second line of defence. Many women were trained in administering medical aid, and they would also nurse in aid stations and would staff anti-aircraft positions. These were considered safer than seeing women actually on the front lines, but the time would then come where they were pushed towards the front. Hundreds of thousands were involved in the army, and another role for women was as snipers, and this became one of the best known roles that Soviet women would perform in the armed forces. Some Soviet female snipers had incredible records with their weapons, as Rosa Shanina would kill 59 Germans with her rifle, and even in the ruins of Stalingrad, women would be involved in sniping enemies. Female snipers would creep through the ruined cities and take up positions, and wait for hours and sometimes days at a time to assassinate and kill when they could. Between 1941 and 1945, 2,500 female Soviet snipers fought the Germans, and around 500 survived the end of the Second World War, and they would take out at least 11,000 German soldiers, sometimes even majors and generals. Lyudmila Pavlichenko was considered the most successful and prolific female sniper in history, and she was credited with 309 confirmed kills. However, the German army hated the thought of female Soviet soldiers fighting against them, and they saw it as a backwards policy of communism which they hated. They saw a woman's place as being in the home, and the Soviet female soldiers needed slaughtering in the eyes of the Germans. The use of women on the battlefield was against Nazi beliefs, and they were seen as the lowest of the low, and because of this, women who were found in Soviet uniforms were subjected to harrowing torture ordeals, but they were also dealt with quickly and were executed. It wasn't just the Nazis who fought this, but the German army believed this too. The commander of the Fourth Army when Operation Barbarossa began, Gunther von Kluge ordered that all women who were found in Soviet uniform were to be shot straight away. He said that women fighters were a barbaric and horrific element of Bolshevism, and there was a lot of horror inflicted upon the female soldiers. Officers and commanders inside of the Wehrmacht would also give out their own instructions as to how to treat women on the battlefield if they were captured. They were treated in line with the Soviet commissars, who under Hitler's commissar order were executed straight away, and the Nazi soldiers would shoot them dead as soon as they were captured. These were not given any chance to defend themselves, they were not given trials or tribunals, but they were immediately shot by a firing squad or by an officer who would just tell them to kneel and then shoot them in the head. It was said by the Germans that a woman who took arms against the German army should not have been given a choice to live inside of a concentration camp and live out more days or be sent to a prisoner of war camp, but they then should have their life taken away straight away. Many women were not even given the chance for a firing squad, which was considered to have been a military-style execution, as some women were just strung up and hanged from the nearest tree, or on gallows that were found inside of Soviet villages and cities. They were often left out for a long time to send a message to others not to fight against the Germans. Many of the women who found themselves captured by the German army were executed together after they were captured, but there were some who did get sent to concentration camps such as Ravensbrück, but these were minimal compared to those who were killed. Women also, as mentioned, joined the partisans, and this resistance group was very successful in carrying out attacks in the form of sabotage and demolitions against the Germans. But the Germans would also treat these women brutally if they were captured. Lepa Radic, a woman mentioned earlier, was just a teenager when she was strung up and executed in front of a large crowd because of her resistance. Zoya Kosmodemyamskaya was another teenager who was arrested by the Nazis after a partisan combat mission, and she was beaten daily following her arrest and was tortured, and she gave over no information. But she was then dragged to a gallows herself and executed in front of a huge crowd, and she said, "There are 2 million of us, you can't hang us all," as the executioners placed a noose around her neck. Another young woman, Zinaida Portnova, was 15 when she joined the partisans, and she concealed weapons and conducted sabotage, but she was also tortured, and she did shoot and kill one of her captors, but she was then driven out to a forest where she was executed by gunshot to the head by an SS officer. The general rule for the German military with regards to the capture of women, Soviet soldiers, is that they should have been executed quickly by gunshot or by hanging. This led to many being slaughtered as soon as they were captured and turned over, and they were subjected to horrific torture too. The U-turn Stalin made to allow women to fight for his cause against the Germans showed how desperate the situation was for the Red Army, following the launching of Operation Barbarossa, and there are many women whose lives were lost in the battlefields of the Eastern Front, and there were many who were slaughtered by the Germans unnecessarily. Thanks for watching. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe, and once again, thank you so much for watching.